Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Hello, and welcome back to my 70s TV childhood, the podcast that celebrates what it was like to grow up as a child in 1970s Britain, and the important role television played in our lives and in the lives of our families back then. If you're new to the podcast, a very warm welcome to you. And if you're a regular listener, welcome back. We are now more than halfway through our 7th season and have released over 200 episodes, which still seems absolutely unbelievable. It feels like only yesterday that we began our regular trips back to the 1970s. I know some of you enjoy hearing our stats, so at the last count, we had listeners in 165 countries, which I think is truly remarkable. And people have been listening in from more than 7,000 towns and cities across the world. So how did we get here? Well, largely through the loyalty and support of you, our listeners. I am genuinely moved how many of you engage with us as well as listen, and I'm enormously grateful for all of your comments, memories, and suggestions for the podcast. For those of you who enjoy our quiz, I want to give a quick plug to a new game that will be coming out soon. The finest minds in podcast land have been hard at work on a version of our theme tune quiz that you'll be able to play at home with family and friends, and we are almost ready to begin manufacturing. But before we do, we would really appreciate it if you could let us know whether it's something you might be interested in buying. There is no commitment at this stage, but to help us get the production numbers right, please visit our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com and let us know if the game appeals to you. Any purchases will help towards the costs of producing the podcast, which will be very much appreciated. More details, including the launch schedule, will follow very, very soon. If you have been in touch recently and I haven't replied yet, I do apologise. My day job has rather got in the way, and I know I do owe some of you a response, but thank you to everyone who's contacted us recently. If you'd like to share any of your memories, suggest subjects we might cover in future podcasts, or just say hello, then you can do so in a number of ways. You can leave a comment on our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com or on our social media sites on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube and LinkedIn. A special announcement, we are now also live on TikTok, which I'm still getting the hang of, but I understand that we couldn't be more down with the kids if we tried. You can also email Oliver at my70stvchildhood.com. Now, if you're of a certain age, like me, there's a very good chance that Saturday night in Britain followed a fairly familiar routine. Tea had been eaten. In our house, it was always spaghetti bolognese. As regular listeners may remember, we've mentioned that several times. The washing up was done or left waiting for later in the sink. Your father was settling into his favourite chair, and your mother put the kettle on. And somewhere in the living room sat one television set that the entire family shared. Just think back for a minute. There were no TV streaming services, no hundreds of channels, no mobile phones stealing everyone's attention. When BBC One or ITV put on a big entertainment show, millions of us watched together. And for much of the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, one of the biggest stars on British television featured on many a Saturday night schedule. Yes, today we're looking back at Dick Emery, the man, his remarkable gallery of comic characters, and the BBC One Saturday night programme that became essential viewing for millions. See if you can remember any of the catchphrases. We'll revisit the sketches, we'll explore why audiences adored him, and also just think a little bit about why modern viewers sometimes struggle with parts of his work. As I've often said on this podcast, we should be very careful applying the sensitivities and values of today on history. But it is notable while some popular comedians of the time, such as Morecambe and Wise and possibly Dave Allen, are remembered fondly, Some others like Dick Emery don't seem to have stood the test of time so well. I suppose to understand Dick Emery, we have to first understand what television itself was like. Today, as we've said, we're spoiled for choice, and to be honest, I didn't personally actually watch that much television. And certainly very little at the time it's actually broadcast, which may sound a bit odd from the host of a TV-related podcast, but I think it does show us how much things have changed. Back then, choice barely existed. There was BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV, and that was that. A successful television programme wasn't watched by 2 million people. It was watched by 15, 18, sometimes over 20 million viewers. And it wasn't just families who watched the same shows at the same time, but whole streets, towns and villages watched exactly the same thing at the same time. So the next Monday morning, everyone discussed the same jokes at school, in the factory or in the office. Saturday night entertainment was a great institution, as we've said in a number of previous episodes. There were variety shows, which I generally hated because I found all that singing and dancing a bit dull. But comedians like Dick Emery, the two Ronnies, and Ken Dodd, although the term may be applied quite loosely to the last one named, it was television that was designed to bring the family together, and those performers who got a Saturday night prime slot became household names that we can still remember today. And, as we say, amongst those was Dick Emery. Unlike some comedians who seem to play themselves, Dick Emery built his reputation by becoming other people to the extent that most of us didn't really have a view as to what the real man was like behind the characters. And thankfully he didn't do a Mike Yarwood and "this is me" routine at the end of his show, so we were none the wiser. He wasn't just telling jokes, he was creating miniature comic worlds populated by a series of unforgettable characters, and every week we all tuned in to see who would appear. And we were rarely disappointed. Dick Emery was born Richard Gilbert Emery in London in 1915, and like many entertainers of his generation, his route into show business wasn't straightforward, although his parents were a comedy act in the music halls, and he made his stage debut at a very early age. His parents split up when he was only 8 years old, and his mother gave up showbiz at that point. So the young Dick Emery had lots of jobs like trainee mechanic, office boy, farmhand and driving instructor even, before being called up to join the RAF during the war. He went AWOL at one point to return to London to deal with some family issues, and whilst he was there got a job in the chorus of an opera company, where he was, unfortunately, spotted on stage by an RAF officer he knew, and escorted rapidly back to barracks. Fortunately for us, rather than being jailed, he was put into the RAF Gang Show, perhaps that was a form of torture itself, to entertain personnel in air bases across the country. And there he found his real skill in making people laugh, including a popular character he invented called Vera Thin, the Force's sweetheart, loosely based on Vera Lynn, obviously. And later he was quoted as saying, "I was far better in drag than in combat gear." After the war, he pursued comedy as a career and became a regular voice on radio and a face on television, appearing with many famous performers of the time, including Tony Hancock, who'd become a great friend by this point. His big break came in 1963 when the BBC commissioned The Dick Emery Show, and his years in the RAF really helped him, as unlike younger comedians arriving directly onto television, Emery had spent his time learning his craft in front of live audiences, which, with them, you immediately know whether something worked or not. If they laughed, wonderful. If they didn't, you knew about it. The Dick Emery Show became one of BBC television's biggest comedy successes, running for many years and regularly attracting enormous audiences. It perfectly suited Saturday evenings. The format was pretty simple, really. Sketches, a set of recurring characters mixed with guest stars, a few musical interludes, and short comic sketches. His approach went down well with the audience, and after a while we were all waiting for our favourite characters to make their appearance. This was long before social media, long before catchphrases became internet memes, whatever they might be. Yet Emery's catchphrases entered everyday conversation. I and my classmates repeated them at school. Adults repeated them at work, and I still use some of them with my friends, particularly, Dad, I think I got it wrong again." We got to know his characters and got to the stage where we were just waiting for those catchphrases to come out. Sometimes viewers forgot they were watching the same performer. So who were your favourite Dick Emery characters? The recurring Vox Pop sections featuring Gordon Clyde as a hapless interviewer were one of the most memorable parts of the show, and this was long before this type of thing had become all too common on news bulletins. Let's start by looking back at one of his most popular creations.
Excuse me, miss.
Oh, hello.
Hello. Here's a charming young lady.
Oh, thank you.
Tell me, do you believe in extrasensory perception?
Oh, yes, I'm rather psychic myself.
Can you give me an example?
Well, for instance, when I first met my boyfriend, I knew instinctively that we were completely compatible.
You mean you sensed there was something between you?
About...
You immediately felt his vibrations.
You are awful. But I like you.
Mandy is probably the best remembered. The glamorous blonde, flirtatious, confident, and often completely oblivious to Gordon's interviewing, which always ended with her delivering the immortal line, "Ooh, you are awful, but I like you." It became, I think, one of Britain's greatest television catchphrases, and the title of a film starring Dick Emery released in 1972. People still quote it today. The genius was in the delivery, the timing, the exaggerated wink, and the way she always pushed Paul Gordon to the floor as she made her exit. We always knew, even expected, exactly what was coming, but we loved it anyway. One of the most popular characters in our house was the Toothy Vicar. As my father was a vicar, this one went down very well with all of us. Possibly not my father.
Excuse me, sir.
Oh, yes, my son.
Tell me, do you do anything special on bank holidays?
Oh, yes, indeed, yes. I eke out my stipend by helping one of the local publicans.
From behind the bar?
Oh, goodness me, no. I stand outside and preach one of my sermons. 5 minutes of that is enough to drive anybody to drink.
A great caricature for the time, but probably less relevant today, given the changing role of vicars. But anyway, we still loved it. Dick Emery portrayed women with remarkable physical detail, reflecting what we mentioned earlier about how effective he felt he was in drag. And one of those characters was another memorable one, called Hetty.
Excuse me, madam.
Miss.
Oh, miss. I'm asking questions about family life and so on. How do you feel about mothers and fathers?
Oh, I think it's a lovely game. Let's...
The detail with Hetty was all there in the tiny shuffle, the handbag clutched tightly in front of her, the disapproving expression. Modern audiences may see this as stereotyping or caricature, but I think most of us recognise familiar figures from everyday life. His rougher creations reflected post-war London, loud, opinionated, quick-witted, always ready with an insult and always convinced they knew best. These characters resonated because millions recognised neighbours, relatives or workmates within them. The most notable of these creations was the Bovver Boy, a slightly stupid youth in denim and Doc Martens, who tried and failed to help his father, played by the great Roy Kinnear, to carry out petty crimes.
Dad, I think I got it wrong again.
If you don't remember Dick Emery and all of its delightfully drawn characters, then you must be thinking this seems a bit limited. But he was much more than a one-trick pony, as some of the sketches within the shows displayed. For example, a recurring sketch featured Lampwick, an old man living with his daughter and son-in-law, a situation which many households could relate to, as they could the tensions, particularly between the father and son-in-law, that existed in many households. Each character in the show had a recognisable personality, distinct speech and predictable comic behaviour. In a way, they were a bit like characters in a weekly comic. But because of that, audiences formed relationships with them, and week after week they returned to catch up with their old friends. The Dick Emery show ended in 1981. It wasn't cancelled, but Dick himself had grown tired of the format and constantly playing the same characters again and again and again. He persuaded the BBC to let him produce 2 series of his own show featuring the private detective Bernie Weinstock, played by Emery himself, who also played a number of the other characters. The shows were generally well received, but they weren't really what audiences wanted to see Dick Emery doing. They wanted Mandy or Hetty or the Toothy Vicar. In a way, he'd become a victim of his own success. Unfortunately, Dick Emery was taken ill at the end of 1982 before dying of cardiorespiratory failure in hospital on the 2nd of January 1983, aged only 67. He passed away before the second series of his detective drama was broadcast later that year, and that was his memorial. Well, that, and I suppose making generations of us laugh on a Saturday night. We can't look back at Dick Emery without acknowledging that comedy changes. Material that audiences accepted in the 1970s isn't always viewed the same way today. Some portrayals reflected attitudes that modern audiences rightly question, and certain stereotypes, including gender, race, or sexuality, can feel a little bit uncomfortable now. For example, one of Dick Emery's most popular characters was Clarence.
Oh, hello, Honky Tonks. How are you? Nice to see.
Good morning, sir. You seem to be in high spirits.
Oh, I am. I love being by the sea. I absolutely love it a little bit.
Go on.
Yes. I've written a little poem about it. Would you like to hear it?
Not really.
Then you shall. See, it goes like this. It's great to be by the sea again. In London, you get paler and paler. It brings such a lovely pink flush to your cheeks when you're chased up the pier by a sailor.
With his immaculately groomed appearance, expressive mannerisms, and cheerful greeting of "Hello, honky tonks," Clarence became one of Dick Emery's most instantly recognisable creations. He was portrayed as flamboyant, witty, impeccably dressed, and was one of the most eagerly anticipated regular characters to appear on every Saturday night show. During the late 1960s and 1970s, mainstream television rarely featured openly gay characters, for obvious reasons. Clarence was never explicitly identified as gay, but the character was clearly coded as, well, what should we say, camp. And audiences immediately understood the joke, a bit like Mr. Humphreys in Are You Being Served? But rather than provoking controversy, Clarence became hugely popular. His catchphrase, like some of the others, entered everyday conversation, and many viewers regarded him as one of the warmest and most likeable members of Emery's comic repertoire. Emery's own family later recalled the character was inspired by the chorus boys he'd known backstage in theatres, and that Dick always played Clarence with affection rather than any malice at all. That isn't to say the character is viewed in exactly the same way today. Modern audiences are far more aware of the way gay men have been historically reduced to stereotypes on television, and some viewers understandably find Clarence a product of his time. Yet others argue that, compared with many comic portrayals of the era, Clarence was notable for not being the butt of every joke. He was confident, quick-witted, fashionable, and often ended up getting the better of the supposedly more normal characters around him. Comedy historians have even suggested that Clarence can be seen as an early influence on later character-based comedies, with echoes of his style appearing decades later in shows such as Little Britain. I think it's important to consider two things. Firstly, Dick Emery worked within the conventions of mainstream television at the time. And secondly, society evolves, and as society evolves, so does comedy. Recognising that change doesn't erase his historical importance, nor does it mean every sketch has aged equally well, Dick Emery's greatest strengths remain obvious. Remarkable character acting, extraordinary versatility, brilliant comic timing, and a genuine ability to entertain huge audiences. But television moves on quickly, and new stars replace old ones. Dick Emery influenced generations of character comedians, yet we don't know much about the man himself. He proved audiences would happily follow dozens of recurring characters if each one felt distinctive, and many later sketch shows, such as The Fast Show, owe something to that approach. Like so many of the shows we featured on my 70s TV childhood, the Dick Emery Show was very much of its time, and watching Dick Emery is like opening a time capsule from British Saturday nights half a century ago, which I myself find very comforting, particularly as I fondly remember sitting with my family, all together watching television but sometimes the only time during the week, and feeling happy as we all laughed together. Dick Emery belonged to an era when television united the nation, and, as I say, families laughed together. Friends and neighbours discussed sketches and catchphrases spread without social media. His BBC One Saturday Night Show became part of British popular culture, which we might sum up as one performer, dozens of characters, millions of viewers, and an unmistakable place in British television history. If you remember watching Dick Emery with your parents or grandparents, perhaps today's episode has brought back a few happy memories. Maybe you can still hear that famous catchphrase echoing around the living room. "Ooh, you are awful, but I like you." If so, then do share your memories with us on our blog at my70stvchildhood.com or on one of our many social media sites, mentioned earlier and also included in our show notes. Alternatively, you can email Oliver at my70stvchildhood.com. That's all for now. We will return in a week's time with the next of our 70s TV trivia quizzes, and in a fortnight with our next podcast. Until then, take care, look after yourselves, and if you find yourself making any mistakes this week, please do follow up by saying, Dad, I think I got it wrong again." Join us again soon for more from My 70s TV Childhood.